Library. On behalf of my partners in the Holocaust and Genocide Research Partnership, through which we are hosting tonight's event, I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's launch of Dr. Anna Hájková's important new book, The Last Ghetto, An Everyday History of Theresienstadt. We're so pleased that you could join us this evening. It's so wonderful to see so many of you gathered. Theresien, as it was known in Czech, or Theresienstadt, as it was known in German, was operated by the Nazis between November 1941 and May 1945 as a transit ghetto for Central and Western European Jews before their deportation for murder in the East. Theresien was the last ghetto to be liberated, one day after the end of the Second World War. The Last Ghetto offers an immensely readable, in-depth analytical history of the world of Theresienstadt, the quote, well-known, poorly understood ghetto, in Dr. Hájková's words. She offers an unflinching critical assessment of how the ghetto functioned, in particular by unveiling and analyzing its social hierarchies. Rather than depict the prison society that existed with Theresienstadt as exceptional, Dr. Hájková argues that such prison societies that developed during the Holocaust are best understood as simply other instances of the societies human beings create under normal circumstances. And I'm just going to read a bit as she notes in her masterful introduction. Even if many of the events of the Holocaust would not happen in the quote outside world, whether because of their violence or scale, society during the Holocaust is one of the many versions of what human society can be. I also deeply appreciate how you end the book, Anna, with your discussion of the task of the Holocaust historian, but I'm not going to give that away here. Tonight's discussion between Dr. Hájková and Professor Dan Stone will examine some of these themes in more depth and will hopefully encourage you to read the book if you haven't done so already. We'll also be providing some information on how to purchase the book at a discount if you haven't done so. We're pleased to launch Dr. Hájková's book as part of our engagement activities organized by the Holocaust and Genocide Research Partnership, which aims to reframe public engagement and heritage practice about the history and memory of the Holocaust and genocide, and to bridge the gap between public understanding of genocide and dynamic new scholarship, such as The Last Ghetto. Before I introduce our speakers, just a few notes of housekeeping. You will be kept on mute during the entire program, but if you have a question, you can enter it into the chat at any time, either directly to me or to one of the co-hosts. After the formal conversation, we'll try to get to as many of your questions as possible. The event is also being recorded for our YouTube channel, but your video will not appear on the screen. We've also enabled auto captioning, so please feel free to switch that on at the bottom of your screen, and we'll also let people know how to do this in the chat if you wish to do so. Please note that it is automated, so there are sometimes discrepancies between what you see on the screen and the spoken word. And if you have any technical difficulties, please feel free to send a direct note to me or to my colleague, Dr. Imogen Diel. Now to our speakers. Dr. Anna Hájková is Associate Professor of Modern European Continental History at the University of Warwick. She regularly contributes to mass media in English, German, and Czech in the publications Haaretz, Süddeutsche Zeitung, Tablet, and Tagesspiegel. She holds a PhD from the University of Toronto. She will be led in conversation by Professor Dan Stone, who is Professor of Modern History and Director of the Holocaust Research Institute at Royal Holloway University of London. He is a historian of ideas who works primarily on 20th century European history. His research interests include the history and interpretation of the Holocaust, comparative genocide, history of anthropology, history of fascism, the cultural history of the British Right, and theory of history. And now I'll hand over the floor to Dan.
Thank you, Christine, and welcome everybody. It's great to see so many people, and I'm really delighted that we're holding this event. Many congratulations to Anna on the publication of this wonderful book. As Christine, there you go, to be purchased at a discount very soon. And you know, this, as Christine said, this is a very rich and impressive book which covers the if you like, the everyday life of Theresienstadt in great detail. Yes, that's my blurb on the back. But you know, from discussions of food and medicine, cultural life in the ghetto, sexuality, medicine, class and ethnicity, religion, as well as chapters on the transports to the east. This is a book which covers every facet of the inmates' lives in the ghetto, and it does so on the basis of archival research in many countries, many archives, I think 76, does maybe, a lot of archives in up to 9 languages. And so I think I wanted to start really by asking you to say something, if you don't mind, a little bit about yourself and your own background, because I'm sure nobody here is surprised that somebody who's Czech is interested in Theresienstadt, but somebody who's Czech who also speaks perfect English and German and can read numerous other languages, Dutch and so on, and is teaching in the UK and is still here after Brexit. I think it's quite interesting, perhaps for attendees, to know something a little bit about your background and how you became interested in this subject, and in particular wanted to write this book.
Thank you so much, Dan, and thank you so much, Christine, for this incredibly generous introduction. I know from my own experience how much work goes into organizing a book launch. And Imogen, I will just briefly technically ask you, can you put it in a way where I just see Dan and me, because otherwise it kind of, the little pictures keep moving and it's a little bit distracting and I'm trying to focus very hard. So Wiener Library is a place where I spent a lot of time throughout the PhD. It was the first time when I lived in the UK back in 2009. It was still when it was at the old address in this very dark house with the steep staircase. And Howard Folkson back then, like today, was incredibly helpful and full of humor and also full of pragmatism, which is important when you write like such a long book. So to introduce this book with my friends and colleagues at the Wiener Library, and Dan, whom I have known now a really long time, is a pleasure and a privilege. And also because the book is finished, now I feel comfortable talking about certain things that as long as I was writing the PhD, I did not, or as long as the book was not out, I was not completely comfortable sharing. So the place and time where I grew up is long gone, and sometimes I feel a little bit like a witness doing it myself, because my paternal grandparents, which is in the Czech Republic, they are well known, but it's a small country, and to be well known in the Czech Republic is not so difficult. They're members of communist resistance during the Holocaust, and they helped the Jewish friends, fellow communists, to go into hiding, to continue participating in resistance. And in fact, one of the first moments when I started conceptualizing this book was back in '99, which kind of dates me when I was a very young student. I went to Israel and my grandparents gave me contact details of their friends. And they still spoke perfect Czech. They were incredibly Czech. They have never really become Israeli. And they taught me so much about Theresienstadt, because not everybody from the circle of the friends around my grandparents from the communists did go into hiding. Some of them were deported and some of them were lucky enough to survive. And that is the story that some of you will know. One thing that I have not really been talking about beyond the circle of friends, because I was a bit worried, maybe too self-conscious, that it could appear untoward or opportunistic, is the family, my mother's family, who barely survived the Holocaust as offspring of mixed marriage. My great-grandfather was deported to Theresienstadt and did not survive following the suicide of his Gentile wife. And one of the really important moments for the whole family was coming across certain documents, the last traces of my great-grandfather from Theresienstadt, his unsuccessful application to be taken out of transport. And of course, it does not change anything. And yet I saw what an important closure it was for my grandfather, who was back then still alive, and also for my family. And recognizing this human aspect of all of this was quite a driving force for me writing the book. But now I will backtrack a little bit to my paternal grandparents. Fast forward, they both became historians. I am a granddaughter of two Czech historians. They did divorce, and my grandmother became a historian of Czech Jews in communist resistance, of the communist resistance before '89. And she was perfectly aware of the topic, that this is a theme not really wished for by the socialist historiography. And she did so, and she was a believing communist. And one of the things that always drove me was making place for ambivalences and differences in these histories that we believe we know so well. So we had here the believing communist. He did not give up her membership in the Communist Party after 68, who was helping her friends who after 68 were dissidents yet again, get pensions. And I want to end on the note, and Christine, which has reminded me of that, how I basically grew up in the 80s, and various friends of my grandmother who depended on her to get decent pensions would come visit and bring chocolate boxes and would share stories about how it was in the Mauthausen and how it was on the Death March and how they fought with the Polish people and how actually, you know, you really don't understand Polish so well when you speak Czech. And this is a world in which I grew up, and it took me a long time until I realized that not everybody's grandparents survived the war. And maybe it's no accident that my partner's grandparents were in the camps too.
Thank you, Anna. All right, so let's talk a bit more about the book itself then, but also still, first of all, I think with respect to the background to it. So I wanted to ask you more about, before we get to the specifics of your book, about the historiography of Theresienstadt, and how you think, first of all, what you've written changes what we know about the ghetto, and particularly how you think what's been written by historians has changed since the end of the Cold War. And thirdly, with respect in particular to Adler, because I think that he's finally been, if you like, rediscovered in the English-speaking world. His big fat book on Theresienstadt has been recently published in English. His book Der verwaiste Mensch is being translated into English, I think. It was published in 1957 or something, and that's finally being translated. So maybe you could situate your book in the context of the much broader scholarship that exists.
Yeah. Thank you, Dan. I hope I will answer everything. If I forget something, please remind me if I get lost on the way. My book aims to do two things. Yes, it does write a history of Theresienstadt, but it also aims to offer a case study of society in extremis. Because I was quite aware that there will be lots of people out there who will just not care about Theresienstadt so much. But at the same time, there will be lots of people who know everything about Theresienstadt and will read the book and will look for mistakes. So far, I'm relieved that my colleagues who have been doing exactly, well, not reading it to find mistakes, but so far it has managed to stand. There are 3 or 4 main studies about Theresienstadt. You already mentioned Hage Adler, then is Lagos and Polák, Město zamřížemi, or The City Behind the Bars, that came out in the 60s. There's in English, very importantly, Zdeněk Lederer, and I believe one of his sons, Tom Lederer, is today here with us. And it also gave me great pleasure to be able to help to arrange for Zdeněk Lederer's papers to be donated to the Wien Library a few years ago. And then, of course, we have Ruud Bondy's wonderful study of the first elder of the Jews, Jacob Edelstein, The Elder of the Jews, the book is called. It came out first in Hebrew and then was translated into English in the 80s. And all of these books offer a narrative of their own. What did it mean to be in Theresienstadt? And what did Theresienstadt mean? And all of these narratives make sense, also in the context that all of these books were written by former survivors. In fact, I could mention one other important person, Miroslav Kárný, who too belonged to the habitus around my grandparents, even though they were never friends, who was one of the leaders of the Communist Party in Theresienstadt. And I think I spoke about him in September 4th last year when I gave the talk about the underground Communist Party in Theresienstadt at the Wiener Library. And all of these people kind of take Theresienstadt and try to tell a story of what it meant. And I guess here is the main difference of my book. I'm not trying to have a master narrative. Rather, I'm analyzing the master narratives to what they serve and try to show the many histories of what it meant to be in Theresienstadt. At this moment, I will pause and stop being very academic and very nerdy and say, what does it mean, master narrative? Master narrative as a unifying story that a society, often an emerging community, will create to endow themselves with a meaning. Say, the British, in the course of the Second World War, created the master narrative of Blitz and of solidarity. As many historians, including Dietmar Süß, have shown, this is not necessarily how the life under bombing looked like. But having a master narrative that everybody's supporting everyone else and there is a meaning to it made people feel better about themselves. The master narrative that emerged already in Theresienstadt was that there was great culture and care for the weakest, for the children, that Jews who so far were kind of the intellectuals, who were professors and lawyers and maybe physicians, were able to turn this dilapidated town into a place where everybody could live. And it also touches on issues like solidarity, but there it gets vague. And I do not say that nothing of that applies to Theresienstadt, but it gave people who experienced exclusion and marginalization, stigmatization, a way of fitting into this community, because Jewishness did not become a binding factor in Theresienstadt. But being part of the Theresienstadt master community, of the master narrative, definitively did. After all, there was a sizable and growing Christian community of people who were persecuted as Jewish, or racially Jewish in Theresienstadt. And there were also many atheists, and also what it meant to be members of Jewish community and going to services meant completely different things to different people. And that, I believe, is a contribution that I do to Jewish studies and Jewish history of the Holocaust. So I guess I'm quite different from these studies because none of my family survived Theresienstadt. I was not influenced by histories of Theresienstadt. What I have in common, say, with Zdeněk Lederer is that my book too, wait, I hope I will not get lost, is dedicated to those who did not return. Because I did not want to focus on the Holocaust as a competition. I wanted to honor people who perished, and there is no sense in why they perished. There is no meaning in a genocide, and to understand people in the many aspects of the humanity was important to me. Now, Hage Adler. Now I have to make an exception because Adler does not really have a master narrative. Hage Adler, and I have studied his papers at the NIOD in the Netherlands, and I've studied other parts of his papers in the literature archive in German Marbach, is such an impressive early work of scholarship written at a time when very few people were interested in the Shoah. However, as a historian of Theresienstadt and of the Holocaust, Verheimlichte Wahrheit, and I'm delighted to hear from you that it's going to be translated into English, which I did not know. The book of edited primary documents from Theresienstadt is a better work than his Theresienstadt account that was translated by my friend Belinda Cooper. Adler was hugely influenced by his positionality as a German-speaking Prague Jew and intellectual. And he had a bit of a tendency to judge and to settle his scores afterwards. That is completely understandable, but writing about many of his old, I don't want to say enemies, let's say contrahents, who were murdered in Auschwitz, is difficult because once you write a book, you set it in stone. And we know certain such accounts about, like, say, Gonda Redlich, because Gonda Redlich headed the youth welfare department in Theresienstadt. Adler applied to work as a Madrich, as a youth care worker. He was rejected. Some of you who are listening will know about what Redlich is saying about Adler's application in his diary. Adler does not come so well, and Adler never forgave him that. And in fact, in Marbach, you see some correspondence that Adler wrote to Yehuda Bakon, who is still alive, one of the children who survived Theresienstadt and Auschwitz, where he's trying to massage Bakon to testifying certain things about youth care and Redlich that Bakon is not quite willing to do. Of course, today, this would not be kosher history, but this is written in the 50s. So what I would plea for is understanding Adler and his work as a narrative of its own, as a discourse that is worthwhile to be analyzing rather than a book of history on Theresienstadt. Many people talk to me about Adler. Many people volunteered the assessment that Adler's book, that is about 900 pages long, is not a book that you sit down and read. It's a book where you sometimes look up things. But once you start looking at it as somebody who has seen the same sources, you see that he had the same problem like I had. There are so many sources and they are so long. Where do you end? How do you begin? How do you analyze all of it? And what he often does is that he basically summarizes or reprints certain facts. He quite often reprints the whole sources. Sometimes there are mistakes. This is completely human, that like, comma shifts. But when you talk about food distribution and the amount of milk and the decimal comma drops, then it starts being problematic. I hope maybe somebody is listening that also my book where I actually made a point of not picking up fights with Adler can be understood as a contribution to the ongoing scholarship on Hage Adler. So far, I have never really been approached to contribute to it. And I think it's a shame because I have valid things to say. And the approach to Hage Adler, I do understand why it's been so positive, because it's somebody who still needs to be introduced to English language scholarship, but sometimes it kind of touches on hagiography. And I think Hage Adler deserves a proper critical approach because he was a critical intellectual who was not afraid to fight. That was a long answer.
But a very good one. So thank you very much. And also, I think his novels are interesting, right? So, I mean, he definitely deserves a proper critical appraisal, but we'll come to that another time. I want just one more thing about you as a historian, connected to this. And although you don't write a lot about sexuality and the history of sexuality or queer history in this book, I think you're probably best known as a historian of sexuality, and issues such as sexual barter do crop up in The Last Ghetto. So I wondered if you would like to say something about the merits or the advantages or the need to write a history of sexuality in the context of the Holocaust.
Mm-hmm. I will start by saying it needs to be done extremely carefully with lots of empathy and lots of analysis. I will never forget this actually quite mortifying moment when a dear colleague of mine introduced me to a very senior scholar by saying, Anna works about sex. And what will you say to that? Either you will turn it into joke and make your colleague laughable, or you will kind of fall into this titillating trap. I have always worked on sexuality because it's such a salient field to understand something about human society. And I think this is what my work is best known for, that people come to sexuality because they think it's interesting. And they stay with it because it's interesting, but not for the reasons why they came. People fall in love, they expect sexual desire, they engage in sexual violence to make a point about power. They are traumatized by experiencing sexual violence. They stigmatize others on account of same-sex conduct and desire, and they other. To express that somebody is wrong, people often use ascriptions of sexual otherness as pedophile or as queer, or as somebody who gave up their partner in the time of need, or as somebody, especially a woman, who is too sexually active. I mean, something that I love, that I find is a very useful exercise when talking with my students is to make them look for a neutral one word to describe a woman who has changing sexual partners. There is no such word. Then we will find some halfway neutral words for men, but not for women. And that already is very telling because, of course, language is the linguistic landscape that sets up power in which we live. So sexuality, and here I built on work of people like Dagmar Herzog, Jennifer Evans, Lisa Heinemann, Annette Timm, and my own Dr. Mutter, Doris Bergen, is a place of muchness. And when we read carefully and do not read things into sources and also listen to the silences, we can find so much about values and agency of these people. And this is so important because Holocaust society, the society of Holocaust victims, has often been reduced to kind of these gray people stripped of agency on their way to death. And I was always fascinated by what happens in these last days, weeks, months, and years, in which most of them die, but they still fall in love, they still fight to go with their husband and not with their mother, or with their mother and not with their husband. Or they find out in the camps that they are attracted to the same sex. And this tells us a lot about these people and also helps us discover the individuals in the grey mass. And I guess that was for me the biggest challenge as a historian of the genocide.
Thank you, Anna. Yes, and I think it will remain one for a while. But that's something with which you're familiar, I'm sure. I think, I mean, the history of sexuality, I suppose, could be considered part of a bigger approach to the past, which is, I suppose, cultural history. And in your book, there's a lot about class and ethnicity, about religion, about art and music and medicine. It's not a history of Theresienstadt in the context of the final solution. You know, from a perpetrator perspective, it's not about how the ghetto fits into the final solution of the Jewish question. It's about the everyday life of Theresienstadt. What does that cultural history approach do you think?
I guess most classically, my book is Alltagsgeschichte, or history of everyday life, or historical anthropology, or microhistory. In my opinion, and I've read the theories, and you, Dan, have read the theories, these are basically the same umbrella terms to describe the moment in which the historian behaves like an anthropologist, but we do not go to an Indonesian village and eavesdrop on the villagers. We go into the archives and we look at the sources, and we do not necessarily read them in order to find out the Rankean of what has actually happened, but we read them to observe patterns and humor and emotions, how they express family and kinship, how they assign values, how they think about food and what is important to them, what wounds them up, and where are they silent? When do they speak at length, and when are they brief? When are they eloquent? When is the style, like, you know, it's something that I always found so fascinating is reading testimonies as literature, because there is some literary values to them, but it is not always great. But independently, whether it's great literature or whether it's a little bit more pedestrian, that all is salient. And it can tell us how people came to terms with imprisonment. Incredibly important was not only looking at post-war testimonies, and you will be familiar with this whole discussion around Shel Friedlander and Alexandra Garbarini. Can we only work with diaries, or can we look at post-war testimonies? That goes back to the doyen of Holocaust studies, Raoul Hilbach. And with that, I could develop an understanding of an anthropologist. How did this society work? But also, it's not a static society. It constantly develops. It's also not one society or one bubble. Theresienstadt are many different bubbles that are all interconnected, but say the situation of the German-speaking elderly, or even the Czech elderly, or the young Czech Jews who arrive on the construction detail, on the Aufbaukommando, are radically different. And yet they are all incarcerated in the same place. They cannot leave. They are afraid that they will be sent to the east and that they are bitten by the same bedbugs. So it is the history of everyday life that can actually help us develop these questions and develop, I guess, a line of inquiry how to make sense of these sources, because someone like Peter Klein, whose work I found incredibly insightful, would look at the same sources and come to a somewhat different conclusion. And in his wonderful book about Ghetto Lodge and the surrounding, he showed exactly that. And that's important. And I don't know if I would be able to do that. But this is the beautiful thing of writing as a historian. You can pose the questions that you are interested in, and that's what we do, I guess.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. Can I ask you about one specific facet then in the context of Theresienstadt, and that's ethnicity? And you talk in a bit about the growing importance of ethnicity, but what specifically does it mean in the context of Theresienstadt?
Yes. So, you know how I touched on the bit how Jewishness does not become a common factor in Theresienstadt. That was for me one of the really surprising things when I was, I guess, 1 year into the doctoral dissertation research, that I found out that while everybody is at least nominally Jewish who was deported to Theresienstadt, it does not create a common sense of Jewishness. Similarly, like so many British academics are migrants, but we don't have a common identity as migrants. We actually start feeling quite British. In fact, Dan, you touched on Brexit. I am British myself too. I'm now a dual citizen, Czech and British.
Bad luck.
So, well, yes. So ethnicity, as I found out, is something that emerges out of the incarceration. People stress the ethnic differences and they see them where there are none. Something that I touch on in the second chapter, but actually throughout, is what I call the ethnic gaze, where prisoners look at each other and they stress the cheekbones, the hair color, the eye color, whether people are tall or short, whether they are athletic or whether they are, thin, how they behave, how they move, whether they wear makeup, what kind of clothes they wear, and out of it, they cook and engender presumed ethnic differences. Now, I want to stress here, this is construction. Yeah, there are no different cheekbones and different hair colors and different sizes and whatnot. But you see the elderly German and Austrian Jews, how they link the social elite of young Czech Jews to their presumed beauty. And they constantly describe them as beautiful, but they are beautiful because they are non-Jewish. And in fact, I will draw your attention, and Christine or Imogen, if you can, if you want to write it into the chat, I have created a website for the book called thelastghetto.org. And under images on this website, you can find some of the illustrations from the book in high resolution and in color. You can also find there maps that my partner drew for the book, because she's an architect and there was overtime to have new maps from Theresienstadt, because, by the way, what you find in Adler are the maps that the Jewish cartographers have produced in the ghetto. So now finally there are new maps for Theresienstadt. So this is just one example. I show many more examples in Theresienstadt, and then you see how the narrative or how the discourse goes. That something like, because Czechoslovakia is the country where in the western part you have the spas with the hot springs, this is why the Czechs are particularly prone to anger and they can be so emotional, because I guess the mentality goes in this narrative that there is the country with former volcanoes and Karlsbad and Marienbad and whatnot. This is why people also get all emotional differently from German Jews. That does not mean that German Jews would not get emotional. It also did not mean that I am nonstop angry because I myself am ancestor, descendant of Czech Jews. It rather shows how enforced community will start creating ethnic differences. Really influential for me when I was a young graduate student was a seminar that I took with Laura Putnam and Bruce Venardi, where we read quite a bit on constructivist anthropology, where I remember there were studies about people living in one valley, and by looking at a different valley, where probably the people were just the same. And it's again the story about cheekbones. And they started ascribing to them ethnic differences and seeing their dialect as a completely different language. And something similar happens in Theresienstadt, and it is completely flexible. Something that sometimes kind of I really wondered about is, what would the society look like had it not lasted 3.5 years, but 20 years or 30 years? Would have everyone learned Czech? How would that Czech look like? Because everybody in Theresienstadt speaks German, even though some of them really poorly, but the language of power is Czech. And then you see how the older Austrian and German Jews, how into the diaries and letters to friends back in Germany, Czech starts creeping in, and they sign with maminka, mama, not with mutti, or they call shelf Polička, but because they don't know how to spell Polička, they misspell it with CZ and not with Ch. I think I've seen Sybil Ruth here, and her relative wrote a really amazing poetry in Theresienstadt. And in that poetry, you see how the Czech starts creeping in, but maybe it is not crept in, maybe it's a deliberate choice. And now the last bit on this, and that's, I guess, an important point, is this emergence of ethnic differences is always linked to social hierarchies. And I guess here I would be happy if further historians of nationalism and also anthropologists who look at ethnicity would engage with my work, because people are fascinated by the Holocaust, but not many scholars of related fields take insights from the Holocaust into their fields. I mean, Dan, you have made the same point well before me. And I think, and Christine, you said that before, Holocaust is part of human history and it's part of what humans are. And many of the moments we can observe in how society reacted in the Holocaust cast light on other non-genocidal moments. So I think this case study of Theresienstadt at emergence of ethnicity out of nothing I would like to see it done for other studies of camp society. I know that Nick Waxman has been writing about Auschwitz. Maya Zudeland has written about it very eloquently in her study also about society in the concentration camps. But I think this is an insight that could be taken and applied more widely. Now, very possibly scholars will find that I have done mistakes and that it does not work exactly in the way one I have spelled out, but I very much believe the direction is something that is worth pursuing.
Brilliant, thank you. That's a really full answer. And now a simple question based on the title of your book, which is Theresienstadt a camp or a ghetto?
Yeah, that's an old question, but this is a question on which some people is a hill willing to well, die a little bit. And the insistence that Theresienstadt was a concentration camp has important and simple explanation. After the Second World War, the genuine suffering, the authentic resistance was seen in the political survivors. And we know from many historians how this came about. I think you reviewed Emma Kubi's book about the emergence of the so-called political survivors, and how this narrative and hierarchy of who are the proper survivors, and then also Jews, came about. And with that, the site of suffering became concentration camps, and ghettos became a little bit forgotten. And as Martin Dean many times pointed out, ghettos could be just as horrible or much, much more deadly. This is another reason why we knew for decades and decades so little about ghettos, because there were so few people to tell the story. When you look at Warsaw Ghetto, and today in the Roman calendar, we commemorate the beginning of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the 19th of April. There are not so many people to tell the story, and proportionately, we have more survivors from Theresienstadt. To put it in big quotation marks because so many people have perished. So this is the explanation why Jewish survivors coming back from Theresienstadt and the camps afterwards, they felt that they need to tell a story that will be recognized as genuine suffering, and therefore they framed the experience into a narrative that was acceptable, and therefore they described Ghetto Theresienstadt as a concentration camp. They spoke about it with verbs that are actually preserved for the political resistance, and so on and so on. And that really influenced how Theresienstadt is seen to this date. Yet Theresienstadt, when it was set up by the Nazis until the end, was described as a ghetto. This is how the Nazis called it. This is how the prisoners called it. You have many similarities between other ghettos in Theresienstadt. Prisoners did not wear uniforms. Men and women could meet during the day. It had a Jewish self-administration. There were elderly and there were young people. Yes, there are some differences. Theresienstadt was in the all of the town and not only section of the town. But I do want to mention Martin Dean yet again. At one point, I was kind of discussing with Martin the question, the camp or a ghetto, and what are exceptions and what are rules. And he was like, really, there are so few rules to ghettos. I have seen ghettos that had uniforms. I have a ghetto somewhere in Ukraine. I have a ghetto in his research for the USHMM Encyclopedia of Camps and Ghettos. He found a ghetto that was set up in a library. So it is worthwhile to look at who is running this enforced site. Is it the IKL or is it the 4B4 of the Rice Security Main Office? And yes, the Theresienstadt was run effectively by 4B4, by the Central Office for the forced emigration of Central Europe, of Jews of Bohemia and Moravia, and then by the commandant, and you have constant visits of either Eichmann or his deputy, he's coming to look at Theresienstadt. So you do not have a hard definition of what is a camp and what is a ghetto, which may disappoint some people who are not familiar with this debate. But from the points that would specify something more as a camp and more as a ghetto, Theresienstadt definitively is in the ghetto corner.
Brilliant, thank you. That's a very clear answer. Maybe a harder question, which is about what goes on in Theresienstadt and how it's been written about, and what you write about in this book in terms of everyday life with respect to medicine, ethnicity, religion, love, and sex, and so on. All of these things, I think, take people away from what they're familiar with. I think when most people think about Theresienstadt, they think about painting, they think about the children's poetry, they think about music, and Theresienstadt as a site of great cultural production. If we think about I was going to say the camp, the ghetto in that way, do we buy into a kind of, do we fall into a sort of Nazi trap of thinking of this as a particular place for ostensibly for particular Jews, or is there some merit to thinking about the cultural production of the ghetto?
No, a little bit yes, but mostly no. I think beating ourselves up whether we follow the Nazi perspective, unless we read really the sources, like the perpetrator sources, or I know Katarzyna Persson today posed the important question on Twitter, like everybody's posting the photographs we have from the end of Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. The photographs we have are from Jürgen Straub's album. This is perpetrator gaze. Do we really want to duplicate the perpetrator gaze? And yet this is what we have from Warsaw Ghetto. Similarly, the most famous pictures from Theresienstadt are the photographs taken by the Red Cross visit. That is not a clear-cut perpetrator gaze, but it is pretty much perpetrator gaze. So the most important thing for situating the children, the art, and also the importance of music and other things is we cannot take it out of the context how they came to be. And I guess this is where I am gently trying to offer some context and also encourage the readers to never take it out of the context, because otherwise we will not understand, say, if you go to Prague, well, once we can all travel again. Guys, if you have not been to Prague, I very much encourage you to visit the city where I was born. If you visit the Jewish Museum and buy the whole tour, you will be able to visit the Pinkas Synagogue, where in the 60s was one of the first monuments for the Holocaust of Czech Jews was erected. You have there the names of all 80,000 Czech Jews who perished in the Holocaust, including my relatives. And the other thing that you have there are the children's drawings from Theresienstadt that have become really world famous, thanks to Hanna Volavková and Jiří Weil, about whom many people have written, including Magda Veselská. But why do we find these children drawings so important and so striking? Not because these are children's drawings. These children drawings appeal to us so deeply because they had a very special art teacher, Friedrich Brandeis, who was a Bauhaus educated artist and architect who worked for many years in Vienna and then fled to Czechoslovakia. Anyone who would be trained by Friedrich Brandeis would produce remarkable art, and this is why these drawings talk to us so much. This is just one example that Elena Makarova and other people have drawn attention to. We often stress the wonderful conditions for the children in the youth homes, but this is not the whole story. There were better homes and there were worse homes. There were conditions for the madrechim, for the youth care workers, and there were different conditions for the homes in which the German-speaking children lived. It also changed over the time. I cite from the testimony of youth care worker who said, people don't want to hear it, but there were children who were well liked and had it relatively good, and then there were children who were not so well liked and they had much worse conditions. And yet, children overall had much better access to food and to hygiene than other groups. So in order to understand the position of children, we have to look at it with the condition of people between 18 to 65, and then the conditions of the people above 65 who received the worst accommodation and who received also much worse foodstuffs. I see that Duncan is sending me a direct message. Duncan, please do not send me direct messages. Send them to Christine Schmidt, who can then read it out, because this will just confuse me. Sorry, I'm really trying to focus here. So this is just one example how to make sense of the conditions of children. Another example is that of cultural life. And I hope I will not brush any feathers by saying the following. Art production in Theresienstadt in theory was free and available for everyone, but this is not how it played out. There was, you can't call it a black market, because black market would imply that there was a like official market outside. But you could apply with the Jewish self-administration to receive the tickets for, you know, the Kiss by Mozart or something else. But then people who were able to offer something in exchange had much better chances of receiving these tickets. So we know from the diary of Eva Robičková, who was this attractive and well-liked woman who was herding the sheep, and she also often worked in the agriculture outside and was able to smuggle in cucumbers and tomatoes and whatnot. And in a situation where there is almost no fruit and vegetable in the ghetto, to smuggle in 2 or 3 kilos of tomatoes makes you a very wealthy person. And she speaks at length in her diary how she brings in this food and what she exchanges it for, and she's really rich, and she does reflect on that. And yet, when they showed the second production, the second premiere of Requiem, which was a big cultural event in December 43, she still was not able to get tickets. So all the celebration of Requiem needs to be put into the place that there's a lot of people who want to see it, and not everybody will be able to do that. Now I will complicate it by further saying that taste in what art we find meaningful and beautiful depends on the habitus where we come from. Some of my students love watching The Only Way is Essex. I do not love watching The Only Way is Essex. It does not mean that I am more, that my taste is more refined, even though I probably want to believe that. The point here is that what we find amusing and beautiful and intellectually interesting is based in the habitus where we come from. So for the older German Jews, Bedřich Smetana, or Friedrich Smetana as he may be known in the UK, was kind of an operette. And for Czechs, this is amazing art that moves us deeply, and we watch it and we cry. And this is how we have been reached to do. And yet the last bit is, well, I guess 2 last bits, is the Requiem production also stands in the context that the musicians Theresienstadt, similarly to the Jewish self-administration, similarly to doctors, understand themselves first and foremost as musicians, as physicians, as bureaucrats. And they do this work as a measure of agency and control vis-a-vis the Holocaust. They still do their job really well to prove to themselves that they are not just expelled Jews, but they are someone. This is why Raphael Schechter, the conductor of Requiem, puts on Requiem, because in the 30s, if you were a big boss composer, conductor, this is what you put on. And this is why the physicians in Theresienstadt have the musical colloquia and so on. And the last bit is, depending on what is your access to resources, and if you are producing art, you will have access to much better production space. You will have access to better or younger or fitter actors and actresses. And this is also the story of Philip Manes, whose work has been so importantly edited and produced by the Wien Library, vis-a-vis the other artwork that we may know from Theresienstadt in the Czech context. And it is to this moment that in kind of the Czech-centric, young-centric focus on Theresienstadt, Philip Manes and his work has not really been paid attention to. And I try to bring it all together, not to say there is one way to read it all, but there are these various perspectives, and when we see all of them together, we understand Theresienstadt.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Christine, I don't see any questions yet in the chat, but it's 10 to 8. So I mean, I can keep going with a few more questions whilst people...
Yes, I have a couple. So maybe you can ask one more, and then we
Okay.
can start, and people can start to think about things that they want to ask. Sometimes the
Fine.
prompt helps.
Yeah, good. All right, so I'll ask one last question then, whilst people think of their questions, which is, what do you think is the future of the history of Theresienstadt? What is still to be done research-wise from your point of view?
I think the history of Theresienstadt from inside has been written. I know Benjamin Frommer at Northwestern is writing a book about deportations of Czech Jews to Theresienstadt. It's The Road to Theresienstadt, or The City Without Walls. And I'm really curious what he will have written. We, of course, have Wolf Gruner's book about the persecution of Jews in Protectorate Bohemia and Moravia that came out in English with Berghahn and came out in German, I think, with Wallstein. So kind of the rise of the scholarship on that has risen greatly. Something that I would like to see would be a study of the interactions between the surroundings of Theresienstadt and the Czech Gentiles, and also the gendarmes to Theresienstadt, because I have seen indications how wealthy people became by smuggling food into Theresienstadt. And if anyone looked at it, it was usually quite uncritically. So I kind of tried to leave their traces for people who will look at the topic after me. But I also believe if this study will be done by a Czech historian, he or she will sit themselves into a box of worms. I have seen a little bit of some of the attacks that people like Kateřina Čapková and Benjamin Frommer have experienced. Even my work on sexual violence that happened in Theresienstadt has been attacked as an analytical question. I mean, giving voice to a woman who for many years after experienced sexual violence from a fellow prisoner tried to bear testimony. I find it as this epicentrum of ethics and not something that should be unethical. At the end of the day, it is committing sexual violence that is wrong and not bearing testimony about it as a survivor. And only when we will change that, we will become a more feminist and a more equal society. And I do want to say it here, it's like a big part of what we do as Holocaust historians is paying attention to power hierarchies and differences. I know that Ben Frommer has been also looking at mixed marriages. Something that I'm playing with is to look at mixed marriages in the protectorate that fell apart, because we have this skyrocketing number of mixed marriages in 1930 in Bohemia, and we have only a fraction of them that are still together by 1945, implying that many of these people must have gotten divorced. And I know from anecdotal evidence that so many of my people in Theresienstadt are divorcees who their partners left behind, or they divorced for whatever reasons. And this is a very difficult topic to look at. And it's something I definitely did not want to do in my first book, but it's something that I find interesting. Now, those of you who came to my lecture in September, you know that I've been working on an article about the Communist Party in Theresienstadt and how can we conceptualize resistance. But I guess to go back, the biggest challenge I see the interaction between the outside inside with Theresienstadt, something a little bit similar to people who have been working on Warsaw, on Białystok, on which I've been doing, but this will not be an easy work politically.
No, but it will be extremely interesting, I think. So yeah, a good answer. Thank you. All right. In your introduction, you talk about the overdue need for a critique of redemptive sentimentalizing Holocaust narratives, and you have done that with great aplomb this evening. So thank you very much for your wonderful answers. Let's see what questions that we've got now. There's one here that I can see, which is from Alessandro, which is, what do you think about the city of Terezin today? Interesting.
Well, Terezin, that is the Czech name for Theresienstadt, as Christine mentioned, is so interesting because pretty much everything is still there. I mean, there you have like 3 new buildings, and 2 or 3 of the buildings disappeared, and it took me a lot of time at work, a support of my colleague Tomáš Fedorovich, to figure out for the map where you had the South barracks. But you really can go there and pretty much see how it was, only it is less dilapidated because over the last 30 years, it has been fixed so much. People like Krista Hegborg and others have observed on the interactions of the inhabitants of this local town, the daily visitors who come on tour buses or public transport from Prague, and then the people who work in the Terezín Memorial. And it's also a huge statement on class, because the tourists who come are, compared to the locals, middle class or relatively wealthy. Terezín is not a wealthy town at all. There is a significant Romani population that is even more ostracized than already the not very wealthy locals. I know that the people who work at Terezín Memorials, who are fabulous researchers and full of solidarity and really helped me doing this work, are not terribly well paid. You do not get a good salary when you are a museum worker in the Czech Republic. That also raises some questions, and I guess there is a bit of this expectation not to thematize it, but of course it structures the reality in which people live. And you know, you and I, Dan, we don't think about having access to JSTOR and to all of JSTOR, and if you need interlibrary loan, it comes here in 3 days and we don't have to pay for it. And this is not the conditions in which the scholars at the Terezín Memorial work. And also the material conditions, of course, I mean, JSTOR is not part of it, of the people who live in Terezín. So for me, a really important moment was meeting my friend Alice, I will not mention her last name, who works in Terezín, who is the local chronicler, who is a great woman who never went to high school and she never went to university, and she knows so much about Theresienstadt, and we have always been in exchange. Always when I come to Terezín, I visit her and we hang out a little bit. But it's also a good reminder about my positionality, and that, yes, while living in the UK where everything is expensive and we have Brexit and whatnot, it is not always easy. But compared to that position, I do not have to think about going to Sainsbury's or to Waitrose. And that is a privilege and it's worth thinking about. So I don't have an answer to that. But it's also worth thinking about East and West, and that we do not turn, I guess, a bit into the colonizing gaze where we just go to Terezín and zoom in on, I want to see the ghetto, and everybody else is just like living here in this background. I think that's very problematic. I don't have a good answer for what it all means, but I think it's worthwhile to listen, and to also to listen to locals who are a bit disgruntled about all the tourists, because the tourists come to see a city that is not there because they live in Terezín, where they sit in the cafe and gossip and drink coffee for 80 pence because that's what they can afford. And that does not mean that the coffee should be more expensive. It means that they should be paid better money so they can afford better coffee and more cake.
Thank you. There's a question from Harry Legg, who says, he'd be interested to hear if you've come across any significant differences between self-identifying and non-self-identifying Jews in Theresienstadt. So you talk a little bit about the, and you mentioned it before, Christians in the ghetto, Geltungsjuden, and so on. And I wonder, I suppose he wants to know more about the differences between how they thought about themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I write about it a little bit in, or not so little bit, in the second chapter, where I have this whole section how various people made sense of Theresienstadt Jewishness and the Holocaust, and how heterogeneous these insights were, and this echo of voices, this chorus of voices, should influence our understanding of Jewish studies in the Holocaust. So foremost, there are not so many differences independently whether people understand themselves as Jewish and Reform Jewish or Conservative Jewish or Orthodox Jewish, as atheists, as Protestants and Catholics. They have so many similar opinions about Theresienstadt, about whether it's correct to steal, how you can steal, about dating, about sex, about German Jews, about elderly, and so on. And then it comes to this 5% about how will you other your neighbor. And this is where Jewishness really comes in handy. But again, there will be many similarities, because Jewishness will be often used in othering by people who understand themselves as Jews and people who understand themselves as Christians and others. But to be too Jewish, too Orthodox is quite negative. And one of the things that I touched on in the book and really spent so much time thinking about is that some of the statements you find in the sources will make us today, with a good reason, quite uncomfortable, because they are, well, I will just say they are difficult to read. And it's not language we would use today. And I think it is a language that maybe was something that came out from the 1920s and 1930s and the folk community narrative. But rather than judging these people for using this very difficult language, we should ask, what does it mean? What the Christian community, the Protestants and the Catholics develop in Theresienstadt is quite a strong working relationship with the Jewish self-administration. This relationship was never really bad, but it becomes quite strong with the time. And what I found interesting is that the only religious community that works transnationally in Theresienstadt were the Christians. The Catholics and the Protestants, while they have two different services and different organizations, they work with each other very closely. But the Jewish community services are pretty much apart geographically. So the Hamburg Jews will go to the Hamburg rabbi, the Berlin Jews went to Leobeck and to others, and the Prague Jews to the Prague rabbi, and the Plzeň to Plzeň rabbis. Sometimes they will go to visit someone else, but just mostly out of curiosity. I ended up not writing a section about religion because I thought I would basically make points on the example of religion that I've done in the book about other points. But I guess that would be something that once I have time and energy and space, and if somebody invited me to write a chapter about religion in Theresienstadt, especially the Jewish religion, it's something that I would be really interested in. Last bit, my positionality, I did not grow up religious. My parents are profoundly atheist. So for me, this all is incredibly interesting because it's a very anthropological mode. It's very different also from British understanding of Judaism.
Yeah, well, hopefully somebody will invite you to write that chapter. That would be.
Once I have time and energy.
That would be very good. All right, I'm going to hand over to Christine because I think there's a lot of questions.
A few questions that came on my side. A question from Katie about ethnic identity. So we talked a lot about the ethnic gaze. Is there evidence of quote unquote racism in the ghetto? So for example, German Jews believing that they were better or superior to Czech Jews or Polish. You talk about these social hierarchies, but do you have evidence of this sort of outright animosity? And sort of the flip side of that is another question by Zibbel, asking if the deportation to Theresienstadt created solidarity. And I think you sort of indicate that it didn't as a causal factor, but she's asking if there was evidence of different people coming together by being housed together or working in the same place. Is there a spatial element too?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 3 levels of answer. I will start with, I don't know, dear audience, if you noticed how I was trying to answer very carefully the point about some of the uncomfortable statements we find about Jews and how I did not use the R word. So I will continue not using the R word because I think that's a slippery slope and we need to be quite thoughtful in the language we use, and everything I wrote in the book, I spent years and years thinking about. So I will continue to err on the side of caution. That's the first bit. The second bit is how ethnicity is used to ascribe value is dependent on the social position of the speaker. So definitely German Jews will say nothing negative about the young Czech Jews because they are the underdogs looking at the top dogs, and they will describe them as beautiful and charming and interesting and fascinating. And they will actually offer a whole lot of insights. Of course, it's full of cliches, but it is often quite observant. On the other hand, when we look at what the Czech Jews say about the elderly German and Austrian, it is full of stereotypes and it's actually quite thin on information. Just last week, I was discussing my book with the Hamburg colleagues from the Neuengamme Memorial, and they were very interested in how can we look for traces of Hamburg Jews in Theresienstadt. You find many, but you will not find them among Czech Jewish Theresienstadt survivors, unless, you know, they're elderly and they have some Hamburg friends, because what you find are basically these stereotypical, quite negative statements that the German Jews are old and they're annoying, they are begging for food, and this constant accusation that they are loyal to Hitler. And there's no evidence for German Jews' kinship to Hitler. In fact, some of them pick on that, and I really agree that it's held for them. So who speaks how about another group is a statement of power, and it should not be taken for as a given, it should be rather analyzed. I would not say that there was no solidarity, but it is always very contextual. Is it with the people in your room? Is it with people in your job? Is it because you become a member of a political or an ideological group, say Hashem al-Hatzair, or the main Zionist movement, or of the communist group? Some people meet new roommates and are first kind of really skeptical. And then they say, oh, actually, these people really grew on me. And 3 months later, they are best friends. And next thing you know, if they are liberated, they spent the next 50 years corresponding with each other and visiting between Los Angeles and London. So you have those stories too. And this is the beautiful thing in which I guess group pressure doesn't determine everything. People can overcome these pressures, but it also depends on the individuality of the person and also on social capital. Some people are really charming, and you see these old ladies from Düsseldorf who in theory have such bad cards at surviving, but because they are charming, because they are curious, because they pick up on some Czech, and also because they have friends from Germany sending them parcels, they are among the few elderly from Theresienstadt who will survive it. And I will say here, I found it so inspirational, Dan, when you started working on the elderly in the Holocaust, because it was for such a long time as a non-topic. And I think it is our task as historians of the genocide to go and look at people who were considered kind of not important of research, because at the end of the day, all of these people were slaughtered, and they are not more valuable and less valuable victims. Like the children who drew these cute drawings from Theresienstadt were not more worthwhile than the elderly, and the people who volunteered to denounce for the SS were not more worthwhile to be murdered. All of them were victims, and none of them deserve to die.
Thanks for that, Anna. Quite a good answer. And we have many questions, and unfortunately, I don't think we'll be able to get to all of them, but there are still a number of people hanging on. So if Anna, if you can take maybe one or two more, then we'll continue. So a couple of questions have come in about money transfers and care packages. So this one in particular from Sandra. If in terms of the ghetto hierarchy, if money transfers and care packages from outside made a difference to people's status, assuming they reached people inside the ghetto at all.
Yeah, so I don't know anything about money transfers. I may be just like kind of a little bit not on top of my game, but I don't know about money transfers because this is the first thing that was taken off people. But you can receive packages, and depending on what time of the ghetto and where were you deported from, or where are these parcels coming from, your friends and relatives can send you various packages variously often. And then comes the interesting moment when Czech Jews look at German Jews and say their parcels can be more frequent, and the German Jews like Czech Jews and say, but their parcels can be heavier. And it's always the grass is greener. I know for the elderly people in Theresienstadt that pretty much those people who survived had either family or close friends who sent them regularly packages, and or they were house elders. Often the younger people and the Czechs were accommodated in the large barracks, and the elderly were largely accommodated in the small houses. I mean, it's kind of a little bit generalization, but overall, this is how the accommodation played out. And each of the little houses had the house elder. Of course, the barracks also had a barracks elder. And if you were a house elder, you had somewhat preferential conditions and better food and a little bit better accommodation. And that already was a difference enough for the people to survive. But we have, for example, the diary of this old Viennese lady, Camilla Hersch, who is the vice house elder, I think, for a year. And she constantly writes about how she goes on the scale and how much she weighs. And she used to be, you know, she was not tall, she was something like 1.60 meters and weighed 80 kilo. So you guys do the math. I will not be using adjectives here. And then in Theresienstadt, she goes down to 4 kilo, which for somebody who is 1.60 meters tall is very little. And then we have the statement by Karl Löwenstein, the head of the ghetto guard, who visited the pathology at one point and was shocked to see the corpses of the elderly looking like corpses of children, not heavier, maybe 25 or 30 kilo. And when he asked the physicians, they answered that this is how the dead look like. They are emaciated elderly. And until the end, in the diaries of the elderly, they talk constantly about what they ate, what parcels they got, and how much they weigh, because they knew it was the link to living. It is rather that something that did not make its way into the histories of Theresienstadt and also into the Jewish histories of the Holocaust. And I think if people constantly write about what they ate and what was in the package and whether they weigh 30 kilo or 35 kilo or 36, it means a lot. And this is the moment of listening and cultural history that is not, you know, just like a historiographical fashion, but can really help us understand and trace what's going on to these people.
Thanks, Anna. And then maybe to close out with a final question from my colleague at the Holocaust Survivors Friendship Association in Huddersfield, Chelsea Sambells is asking what was the most surprising finding you discovered during your research about Theresienstadt?
Hello, Chelsea. I mentioned that already. It was that Jewishness was not a binding factor. I really expected it would. And I guess it is something also that I was reared in my, minor Jewish history. I was educated by Derek Pensla and he gave me so much. But to this date, much of Jewish history is written as a lachrymose history or as a history apart in which Jewish people are different from all other people. And I found out that Jews are people like everyone else. And that is the finding that the Protestants and the Catholics, the atheists and the Orthodox, the Reform and the in-betweens, they all arrive in Theresienstadt. It made them human. So I hope that people will read my book and will understand that Jews have experienced the Holocaust because the Nazis have made them pariahs and deported them and murdered them. But most importantly, they were people.
Thank you, Anna. That seems to be a fitting way to end this fascinating discussion. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this and for bringing us your important research. Congratulations again on this tremendous book. And thank you to Dan for leading the discussion. And thank you to everyone who's signed up and who's attended and for your wonderful questions. Like I said, we will be putting this on YouTube in case you've missed the beginning. And we will also be sending around some information that was requested. I've taken a screenshot of the questions as well that we didn't get to, particularly ones about family research and documents. And I think the library can help you there as well if Dr. Hájková cannot. So,
and also you can email me.
And also thank you so much. And so we will be following up very soon with that information. So thank you once again, and thank you, Anna and Dan.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Good night.